Ready? All right, welcome everyone. You could take your seats. Welcome to the Langenberg Memorial Speaker Series with the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise at Lindenwood University. My name's Howard Wall. I'm the host for today, and glad you can make it in person. You know, brave the cold weather of St. Louis. We've just started into that, so I know you're a bit shivering, and thanks for everybody who's online. Now we have a few announcements before I introduce our speaker. We have tickets that you can take for your parking, a little voucher for your parking that you can just, if you parked in the hotel, you can just put into the machine. You can pick that up on the way out. It's on the table. And you know, the invitations for everybody was, it said we had an open bar. You notice we don't have a bar in here, but if you go to the bar afterwards and show you have your name tag, you can get free drinks at the bar. So we still have an open bar. It'll be over across the way. Because we, as people know who are here, we grew out of the discussion club, and discussion is really a big part of what we do here. So we want you to stick around, you know, have a drink and join us for some discussion about this event and other things. And before we start, let me announce or let you know what our next event is. We have a full slate this year. Our next event is in February, and it is with Mark Shug, who is from Wisconsin. I forget which university, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, or some such place. And he's going to talk about desegregation of baseball, basically the economics of baseball desegregation. So that's a really interesting discussion. So be sure to try to join us for that. Now, for those of you who are online, we have some helpful hints to make this as smooth for you as possible. If you look at these slides of this young gentleman who the picture sold, that's not my son. That's actually me just a few years ago. If you want to get the right view, make sure that you hit the speaker view, right? Select speaker view and up in the upper right-hand corner. And then you'll be able to see the speaker and the slides. And if you want to see the list of other participants and then also participate in terms of the chat, you push the participants button at the beginning or at the bottom in the middle. And then feel free during the course of the event to chat amongst yourselves or put questions in the chat, because those of you who are seeing this virtually, you'll get a chance to have your questions answered. If you put it in the chat, I'll be fielding and culling the online questions. And then of course the audience in person will have questions also. All right, so without any further ado, I would like to introduce to you Phil Magness of the American Institute for Economic Research. We're extremely happy to have Phil. We've been thinking about having him for some time, and certain events, health-related events with the world or something got in the way, but we're past that. And so now Phil is joining us, and he's going to talk about the 1619 project. He has a book on it, kind of assessing the pluses and minuses of it, and he's going to share his thoughts with us. So welcome to Phil Magness.
All right. Here we go. Thank you. All right. Can everyone hear me on the speaker? All right. So thank you everyone for having me. Happy to be here in St. Louis. I can say I woke up in Massachusetts yesterday to fly out here. The temperature was about the same when I arrived. So, but that's all right. Gotten used to it. Winter is here. Our discussion this evening relates directly to my work, but it's an area of my work that has intersected with a very prominent part of the media in the last several years, and that is the New York Times' 1619 project. Before I jump into the 1619 project, though, I want to preface this a little bit by noting that when I first saw this magazine version of a historical project appear in the New York Times, that was in August 2019 when it appeared, I was originally excited. And I was excited for another reason. The reason was that about 5 years earlier, the New York Times had put together what I thought was a really high quality piece of historical journalism that they referred to as the Disunion Project. And if you remember this, it coincided with the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. So they started from 2011 to 2015, so 1861 to 1865, and almost every day ran a column that reflected on the legacy of the Civil War and related issues, including slavery. This column was done by, probably over the course of the 4 years that it ran, hundreds of contributors. They included everything from academic historians and scholars and political philosophers that worked in that area, to journalists, to museum curators, people that give tours on battlefields. And it really brought to the forefront some not only cutting edge scholarly discussions, but interesting, provocative, retrospective accounts of American history that dug deep into and tackled the problem of slavery in our past. Really well done project. And I don't just say that, I contributed 3 or 4 pieces to it. But I was one of maybe 200 or 300 different contributors over the time. And when I opened up the 1619 project that morning in August 2019, you can see that I didn't actually get the print edition. I was reading it off a laptop that morning over breakfast, as I usually do, just going through the newspapers, and was intrigued. I saw that, oh, the New York Times is doing another series on the history of slavery. And this is an area where I've worked, so I was interested in it for personal, professional reasons, but I also remembered that previous project and knew that it was a high quality journalistic venture that tackled serious historical subjects. Then I started reading the 1619 project as it appeared. The first essay, which is by far the most controversial in the public discussion, that's the Nicole Hannah-Jones lead essay, where she frames up the entire project, struck me as something that had some problems, but not nearly as much as was originally claimed about it. It was kind of a mixed bag of an essay. So some things jumped out to me, and I'll get into some of the details of those. But where I really became frustrated by this piece of journalism is when I got to the second major essay, and that was Matthew Desmond's chapter on slavery and capitalism. And I'll get into some of the details there. But I want to highlight these 2 essays in particular, in noting that the 1619 project was a much larger compilation. There were originally, I think, 12 different feature articles and a bunch of little vignettes that short, like 300 or 400 word discussions of aspects of the past. And I really look back at it, we're coming up on, 3 years or so since this came out. And I look back at it, and something is really striking. The striking thing is of those 12 original essays, 10 of them have essentially been ignored. They've been set aside. They aren't part of the discussion. And it may actually be better for the sake of the authors of those other 10 essays that they have not received much attention. But unfortunately, I think they've been overshadowed by the 2 that I mentioned and the controversies that came out of the 2 that I mentioned. I also don't think it necessarily had to be that way. So part of my thesis in critiquing the 1619 project is that this was a journalistic venture that started with ostensibly admirable goals of digging deep into America's past and the trouble and problem of slavery. But in its execution, it went off the rails. And it went off the rails very slowly at first, and then just took a complete turn away from reality in the way that the New York Times handled the fallout and response to political and historical and scholarly and journalistic pushback against everything that it was doing. So there's almost like a tragedy that's built into it of the way that it's handled. And I think that has unfortunately overshadowed those 10 or so other essays that really haven't received much attention, whereas the 2 that have. But I want to dig into the 2 that have and really go through a discussion of where I see the problems, where I see maybe some redeeming characteristics, but also a conclusion that shows where I think the project itself has created a reputational crisis in the way that it handles the relationship between journalism, history, and political advocacy. 2 major areas of contention that came out almost immediately when the 1619 Project was published involved those two essays I described. Nicole Hannah-Jones's lead essay, which digs into a variety of issues, but it was mostly contentious for one particular claim, and that was that the American Revolution was fought, basically instigated in a major way to defend the institution of slavery. Dig into that in a moment. And then the second, which was really the subject of my initial reaction, why I found this venture to be challenged in the way that it presented facts, was an extension of that first essay. After situating slavery as a central issue in American history, and in many ways it is, but not always in the ways that it was presented in the 1619 Project, they take a turn and they say, well, if slavery is central to American history, slavery is also central to the American economy. And a very strong, aggressive, and politicized causal claim was made that slavery and American capitalism are essentially wedded at the hip. And from this, American capitalism, the wealth of the United States today, the status of the United States as one of the leading economic powers in the world, was essentially built off of the backs of slavery. And that taints American capitalism today as it did in the past, according to this thesis. And therefore, effectively, what Matthew Desmond argues in it is that American capitalism needs dramatically altered, changed, thrown under upheaval, and possibly even overturned. And I found in reading this, not an argument about the past, but a weaponization of the past as a tool for very aggressive political claims, mostly of a far left progressive variety, to wage an assault on the free market economy today by tainting it and saddling it with the history and legacy of slavery, which unfortunately I think has become the single most prominent message to come out of the 1619 Project, even though it's the weakest part from an empirical, historical, and analytical basis. Again, the other essays focused on a variety of issues. They dug into criminal justice reform, civil rights, art, literature, music. I generally did not take any objection to them. Some of them were probably a bit more political than I wanted, and I probably disagree with some of those points, but it was within the realm of editorial disagreement. Whereas the framing of those initial two essays, and really that second one, the Matthew Desmond piece, I think have framed an explicit political agenda that we are dealing with today. So I want to dig into some of these claims and lay out how I've assessed them as a historian, how it played out in the public debate. Because immediately after this project was published, well, all hell broke loose in the media in response to some of the political claims in those two lead essays. Most of the attention was focused on Nicole Hannah-Jones in the first one, although quite a bit on the second one. Within a couple days of this being published, I wrote my first piece on it, which was a mild and fairly even-handed critique of the slavery and capitalism piece. It got circulated around, and someone noticed it, and like a week later, National Review called me and said, hey, can you expand this into a full column that will run in our magazine, which I did. After that, the debate continued to play out both in academic and journalistic circles. It did so in ways that enlisted some very prominent leading historical figures, mainly as critics. But it did so in a way that spread across the entire political spectrum, from left to right, libertarian, conservative, liberal, progressive. There were critiques of the 1619 Project emerging all over the place. That week after it came out in print, I strangely found myself in one of the weirdest political alliances that I've ever encountered in my career. I found myself arguing on the same side as not only Newt Gingrich, but also Sean Wilentz, who's a prominent center-left historian at Princeton, and the World Socialist website. All of us were saying more or less the same things existed in the problems of the 1619 Project, and we were going against, strangely, another branch of kind of a progressive left journalistic approach. tied into kind of the critical theory world. So it's a different branch of the political left. This is why the World Socialist website, they're old school classical Marxists, and they hate the critical theory Marxists and vice versa. This is as old as Marxism itself. Stalin purging his enemies and sending them off to the gulag. Most of those other enemies were fellow Marxists that slightly differed. But yeah, strangely, this is the political alliance that has emerged originally around the 1619 Project. So what were the major contentions? First, and this is the one that's been noticed all over the place in the media, it's received probably 75 to 80% of the commentary in the 1619 Project is around this question of whether slavery was the motivating factor of the American Revolution. Nicole Hannah-Jones said pretty aggressively that it did. I want to walk you briefly through her argument. There it is in a screenshot. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but the famous or now infamous passage, she said, the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. And that's the one that really got picked up and quoted all over the place. It was a really bold claim. I also argue that you should pay attention to the very next line, because that's where she links to the economic arguments. She says that by 1776, Britain had grown conflicted over the institution of slavery, and there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies in both the North and the South. So there's the claim that's being made. If America was seeking independence over slavery, it was doing so for an economic reason, to continue to extract wealth out of the plantations. This is a pretty bold and controversial claim. We later found out, thanks to historian Leslie Harris of Northwestern University, about 6 months or so after the 1619 Project came out, and there had been back and forth over this line. Several historians across the spectrum had critiqued it. Leslie Harris broke her silence and went to Politico, the online magazine, and told them basically a story. She said, a few weeks before the 1619 Project came out in print, the New York Times contacted me to be a fact checker on it. And what happened? She read this exact line and said, she's an expert in the American Revolution. She said, that's not scholarly in the way that it's presented, and it's not supported by the evidence. You need to do something about that. Tone it down, change it, add some nuance, add some context. And what happened? New York Times ignored her and ran with it anyway. They ignored their own fact checker. So that was the first kind of major public explosion over the actual content and process of the New York Times. And after months and months of basically incorrigible intransigence in the face of all the historian critics, they relented a little bit and they added like a small qualifier. They said, not all the colonists, maybe some of the colonists, which is a little closer to the truth, but it's still an overstatement. But this is typified the way that the discussion has progressed. But what was their argument? And I want to give it a fair shake. So Nicole Hannah-Jones points out from 1772, there was a legal case in Great Britain called Somersets Case, a very famous case in the history of American and British abolitionism, because the United States was still part of the British Empire at this moment. What was Somersets Case? Well, there was a slave owner from Virginia that was a merchant that sailed across the Atlantic, parked a ship in the dock in London, and on board he had his personal servant, a slave by the name of Somerset. Somerset was being held captive on board Stuart, was the merchant's name, Stuart's ship. And a group of abolitionists in London realized something really interesting. There was no law on the books in England proper that established slavery. There was in Virginia, but not England proper. So they go down to the court and file a writ of habeas corpus, classic doctrine of English common law, and ask the judge to order the delivery of the person of Somerset before the court to be declared free from illegal imprisonment on board this ship. The judge, Lord Mansfield, reads the case, hears the arguments, reviews the evidence, and comes to the conclusion, by God, these attorneys are right. We have no law on the books establishing slavery. Mr. Somerset, you are free to go. A great story in the history of abolitionism. And that's the famous line from the ruling. He says that slavery is such a nature, we can't infer it from the practice that it's legal. It has to take its origin from positive law. It has to be established by a legislative act. And if it is not, it's a fundamental violation of the rights of the person that's being imprisoned. So they free one slave. And this triggers the abolition movement in many ways across the world. British Empire in particular, including the United States, the influence of the United States, which is not mentioned at all in the 1619 Project. The Somerset case becomes the classic legal precedent for dozens upon dozens of freedom lawsuits across the United States from basically the Revolution through the Civil War to attempt to, and in many cases successfully, free enslaved persons that have been taken outside of the territory where slavery is legal. Most famous of these, Dred Scott versus Sandford, comes before the Supreme Court in 1857, was a Somerset case. You can read the legal briefs, and they cite Somerset. They said, this is part of our legal heritage as a descendant of the British Empire. This is our case law. Dred Scott needs to be freed because he was taken to a territory that did not have slavery. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against them, but they were ready to retry the case on the eve of the Civil War. There was another one emerging out of New York State that was a really similar lawsuit to basically seek freedom of slavery. The reason this is important of the 1619 Project is Nicole Hannah-Jones's essay notices it, and she says, aha, this is proof the British Empire is about to abolish slavery. The colony saw that as a threat. Well, not so much. It's a much more complicated story. And how do we know that? Because we know it because Ben Franklin wrote about it, and he had the exact opposite opinion of what Nicole Hannah-Jones's assessment would state in her presentation in the 1619 Project. Franklin is kind of a big deal in the American Revolution. One of the leading figures on the revolutionary side, both in the political sense, as an advocate, a pamphleteer, a speaker. Well, in 1772, he writes a letter after word has arrived of Somerset's case, and he's furious at the British Empire, but not for the reason that they were freeing slaves. He's furious, and because he says it there. He says that this nation we live in practices its detestable commerce by laws for promoting the guinea trade, the slave trade. Well, it piqued itself in its virtue and love of liberty and the equity of the courts in setting free a single Negro. Franklin was mad because Somerset freed only one slave, not them all. He didn't think it went far enough, which is pretty astounding as a contradiction of what the 1619 Project claims about this case. And in fact, we see this as a common sentiment in the colonies. There's another passage, even in some of the southern states. This came from the Fairfax Resolves of Virginia, a statement in favor in support of the Boston protesters in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. Well, what did they do? They denounced the Crown for sustaining a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade in human beings. This one's significant because one of the signers was a guy that lived in Fairfax County, Virginia, George Washington. Even though he's a slave owner, he saw problems with slavery, and this gets into some of the conflict with them. Well, there's another issue that's at play here. The 1619 Project attempted to summarize the entire founding generation as being on the side of slavery and Britain on the side of freedom. That's not the case at all. In fact, in the founding generation, we see a whole range of opinions and perspectives on slavery, some of them great, some of them pretty horrible. And it runs from north to south, but it also cuts across the country in multiple complex ways. There are outright abolitionists on the American side of the Revolution, including some very famous ones. Ben Franklin, I already mentioned. So James Otis, probably remember him from your history textbook, No Taxation Without Representation. He was the guy that Samuel Adams said sparked the American Revolution. He also turns out to be an abolitionist and writes a pamphlet on the eve of the Revolution calling for the abolition of slavery. It's a pretty bold claim. If the central figure of the revolutionary cause is calling for the abolition of slavery, and that's missing from the 1619 Project, that seems to be a pretty big oversight. John Adams, our second president, as well as a major figure in the Revolution. He's not as active in the abolition movement, but he is personally anti-slavery, and all of his writings indicate that as a philosophical basis. You get a little weird category in the middle. I refer to them as the anti-slavery slave owners. But if you think about it, these are people that in some cases had a religious conversion. In other cases, they worked through the philosophy and realized that the practice was inconsistent with the principle of liberty that they were fighting and advocating for. Two of those I want to highlight in particular. The first is Robert Counselor Carter. He is the owner of one of the largest plantations in the colony of Virginia. He has a religious conversion in the 1780s, and one day just randomly wakes up and decides to walk down to the courthouse and files what was referred to as a deed of gift at the courthouse that manumitted his entire plantation. That they're free. This institution is wrong. I've come to realize that. They are free to go. Unfortunately, his neighbors hated him after that and basically chased him out of the state. But it was one of the largest acts of single-person abolition in basically the history of the New World up until that point, which is a very brave and bold story for him to undertake, and it seemed to just come out of personal morals. The other one, anti-slavery slave owners, Luther Martin. He was the Attorney General of Maryland, a delegate at the Constitutional Convention. He was a small-time slave owner in Maryland, but he came to test the institution, and he stands up at the Constitutional Convention and says, this document we're drafting does not do enough to put slavery on its route of extinction. And basically says, therefore, I refuse to sign it. And he says, you're all hypocrites, basically, which is pretty astounding. Then you get into some really complex territory. These are the George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. These are people that own slaves, own plantations, and unfortunately, they don't really fulfill their moral obligation that they do recognize, but they are wrestling with the moral problem of slavery and the philosophical problem of slavery. And then finally, you get down to there it is. The very bottom, the pro-slavery slave owners. These do exist, but it turns out they're actually the most obscure faction of the founding generation. Who knows who John Rutledge or William Lawton Smith are? The founders you've never heard of. They're actually fairly obscure people. They came out of the Carolinas. They articulated theories, pro-slavery theories that later became the basis of pro-slavery on the eve of the Civil War, the positive good theory of slavery. So William Lawton Smith, he attained notoriety as a member of the House of Representatives, and in one of the first Congresses, Quaker abolitionists from Pennsylvania sent a petition to Congress calling on it to abolish the slave trade. And he stands up and denounces and says, slavery is our sustenance. Why am I showing this full range of figures? Because you cannot classify the colonists as a whole, or even part of the colonists, as pro-slavery, anti-slavery. In fact, they have a diversity of opinions on it, diversity of stances, and that actually plays out in their politics. Meanwhile, what's going on the other side? Well, and this is a major point the 1619 Project makes. They claim that in 1775, this is Lord Dunmore, who was the colonial governor of Virginia. Key thing to remember about the American Revolution, we know July 4, 1776, but when did the revolution start? The previous April. Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. It's April 18th, 19th, 1775. The war had been fighting. They had been waging the war for over a year when they actually make the final call to declare independence. So Lord Dunmore, in November 1775, he has basically been forced into exile, chased out of the governor's mansion, and is living on board a British Navy warship in the James River, as the colonial armies had basically cleared out the old government and replaced it with their own. And in an act of desperation, Dunmore issues a proclamation that says, any slave that fights for me and joins my militia will be granted their freedom. But there's an asterisk next to that that's not mentioned in the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project takes Dunmore's proclamation and says, well, see, this is proof that the British were inching toward a threat to slavery itself. Well, what happened in Dunmore's proclamation? That asterisk said, except for slaves of loyal slave owners, those plantations were not covered by the proclamation. So he wrote himself an exemption, and he did that for a reason, because he was one of those loyal slave owners. Turns out he's a pretty bad dude. After the revolution, he gets reassigned as governor of Bahamas and takes up residence in Nassau. And what does he do? He requisitions all the slaves of the island to build himself a massive fortification system. There's records of him just doing really horrible things as a cruel and oppressive governor. So not a good guy, and yet somehow he's become the centerpiece of the 1619 Project's argument. In fact, there you have Nicole Hannah-Jones. For men like George Washington, the Dunmore Proclamation ignited their turn to independence. Remember the date. This is November 1775. There's a little bit of a problem. George Washington had been commander-in-chief of the Continental Army for about 5 months already when Nicole Hannah-Jones says this is what causes him to join the revolutionary cause. So it's just bad history. Bad history premised on faulty factual interpretations. We find this throughout the American Revolution. There are bad guys when it comes to the issue of slavery on both sides, but there are quite a few on the British side. This is Bannister Tarleton, Lord Cornwallis's cavalry commander on the Southern campaign of the Revolution, also known as the son of the largest slave trader family in Liverpool. And after he loses the revolution, which, why did he go on an adventure to fight in the colonies? He probably thought he was going to get a giant plot of land out of it or something and establish himself a plantation. After that, he gets elected to Parliament and spends the remainder of his career as the leading advocate of the slave trade cause in Parliament, blocking bill after bill after bill to try to abolish the slave trade. He's fighting on the British side. Another interesting character here, the portly fellow is a member of Parliament. This is Charles James Fox, the leader of the Liberal Whig Party for many points of his career. He is active from about the 1780s until he dies in 1807, I think it was. First, I want to mention, I got a little bit of a timeline here. He's significant because in 1791, he's the member of Parliament that proposes, for the first time ever in history, a bill to abolish the slave trade. And he thought he could do this incrementally. They said, well, abolish the slave trade first and then go after slavery. He fought for that bill from 1791 till 1807 when he finally got the votes to carry it through. It was one of the last things that he succeeded on, and then he died. He sends William Wilberforce, who's a bit more famous today. He's kind of the mentor of that entire campaign, and then in the decades that follow, Britain eventually abolishes slavery in 1834. But this is some 50 years after the American Revolution, and Fox had been fighting that last guy, Bannister Tarleton, in Parliament. The other reason I mentioned Fox, look at him up here. I know the color's a little bit odd. He posed for this portrait wearing a blue coat and a gold vest. This was a middle finger to King George. He had this painted in the middle of the American Revolution. As a member of Parliament, he put on the uniform of the Continental Army, George Washington's colors, and sat down for his portrait and basically told the king, yeah, come after me. So you have a pro-American member of the British Parliament, major figure, who's also anti-slavery. Things are getting pretty complex. All missing from the 1619 Project. And in fact, we have clearer evidence in the timeline that the American Revolution does in fact ignite a wave of successive abolitions very quickly and very rapidly, even before it's won. First occurs in Vermont, which was kind of a no man's land. It was unclaimed territory. Massachusetts, New York, and to Canada. Barely anybody lived there. And in the middle of the American Revolution, the people of Vermont got together and said, we're going to declare ourselves independent as a republic, and we're going to side with the Americans. They adopted a constitution. One of the first things it does is it bans slavery. Ben Franklin begins his campaign to repeal slavery in Pennsylvania, and they enact it legislatively. It's a gradual abolition bill, but an abolition bill nonetheless, and one of the first in world history. In 1780. 1781, Massachusetts tries a legal case following the Somerset precedent. the Walker case and discovers there's no law in the book establishing slavery. Slavery is gone. And then a succession of most of the northern colonies, and then what is now the Midwest, as it's acquired and planned out for admission territorially. In 1787, the National Congress said no slavery in these states. There's the ruling from Massachusetts in 1781. William Cushing, the justice that ruled it, he says that slavery is inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and our new Constitution. There's Luther Martin, the guy I mentioned from the Constitutional Convention. This is what he stood up and said in Madison's note: slavery is inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character. We should abolish it. That voice is always there. It's completely missing from the 1619 Project. And this is where I think the history of that first essay goes far astray from the field, far astray from evidence in ways that really haven't been addressed. Question number 2, is slavery responsible for American capitalism? Because remember the link of those 2 quotes. Well, this jumps into the second essay by Matthew Desmond. Matthew Desmond is a sociologist at Princeton University that, for reasons I still do not understand, was recruited to write the essay on American capitalism and slavery in the 1619 Project. Why don't I understand it? Because it was completely outside of his field of expertise. He had never written on the subject before, hasn't since. There's Nicole Hannah-Jones, writer of the first essay, and I'll show you Matthew Desmond. That's him up at the top. But because he had never written on the subject before, he actually recruited a team of historians to advise them, and they all came from a very narrow historiographical camp called the New Historians of Capitalism. This is a very insular group at a few elite universities in the Northeast that about 10 to 15 years ago, they proposed a new interpretation of American history in its economic relationships. Slavery is at the centerpiece of that, and their contention is essentially that slavery made America wealthy. American economy is a derivative of the slave economy, and therefore it needs political upheaval and overturning. This is a very politicized version of history. Problem is, it's not good history. In fact, if you read some of the new historians of capitalism as they write about slavery, you can put their words side by side with tracts that were written in the 1850s about the economics of slavery. But those tracts came from a very different side of the political spectrum. They came from the pro-slavery side. You can read articles that were written in 1857 that announce that slave-produced cotton is the centerpiece of the American economy and the centerpiece of America's wealth in the world. They called this the King Cotton Theory. We've heard that. It came from a famous speech by South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond before the Senate in 1857. He stands up and he declares, "Cotton is king. Cotton is king of the globe." And it waves its scepter over the economy of the United States and the economy of the world, and none would dare make war upon it, because if they did so, they would be making war upon their own wealth. King Cotton Theory was the economic theory the Confederacy adopted as the basis for its war plan. And they actually tried to strategically play off of it. They said, they went to European powers and said, if you join us militarily, you give us recognition and armaments and maybe even come fight on our side of the war, we'll give you access to our cotton market. Europe balked. The British said, you know, that'd be nice, but we can get cotton over here in Egypt. And we can get cotton over in the West Indies and in other parts of the world, and they'll sell it to us. So it turned out cotton wasn't the king after all, but the new historians of capitalism have reasserted an economic history that claims that it is. Remember, this is the thing that I said I objected to the strongest in assessing the 1619 Project. Well, it appeared in Matthew Desmond's essay, and in the outset of the essay, Desmond starts to lay out his case. But something really interesting and peculiar happened as he laid out his case. There's a clip from it. I know it's a little hard to read, but I'll summarize it for you. He says that American capitalism today is effectively chained to and linked to and derived from the practices and institution of slavery. His evidence, he says, when, let's see if I can read that, when an accountant depreciates an asset to save on taxes, or when a mid-level manager spends an afternoon filling in rows and columns on an Excel spreadsheet, they are repeating business practices whose roots twist back to the slave labor camps. You use Microsoft Excel, you got it from slavery. That was his claim. That's a pretty weird claim, but that was the centerpiece of how he framed his argument up. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, okay, that's a little weird. And then I get a little further down, and you notice he says where he claims he gets this argument from the evidence provided by historian Caitlin Rosenthal, who wrote a book about the accounting practices on the plantations. And he basically goes on and says, well, and then they also did double entry accounting. Therefore, anyone that uses double entry accounting learned that from slavery, even though the Italians were practicing that back like in the 1400s. So there's not very good history, but that one line about the Excel spreadsheet stuck out to me. I thought, where on earth did he get that from? So I opened up Caitlin Rosenthal's book, which I have printed over here. It turns out he made an error of transcription. What does she say? This is not an origin story. I did not find a simple path where slave owners' paper spreadsheets evolved into Microsoft Excel. So she says the exact opposite of what he did in the 1619 project. I'm sitting here reading this, is like, this is amateur hour. So I wrote the editor of the New York Times to ask for a correction, as one would think should happen at a paper of record. Don't hear anything for a while. They eventually got back to me, and the editor said, well, we just think this is an interpretive difference of language. We aren't going to correct it. That's when I start seeing and thinking to myself, something is really wrong with the way they're handling this project. That was like fall of 2019. Get a little bit deeper into this new history of capitalism literature in Desmond's essay. It also declares that capitalism, being wedded at the hip and causally entrenched and then intertwined with slavery, is the basis of unfairness in the American economy today. So he's really talking about capitalism in the laissez-faire free market sense. He says that when taxes are too low and inequality is too high and there's not enough socialized health care and all the litany of causes that read like a far left progressive political platform in 2022 on economic terms, he basically says that this is derivative of slavery. At one point in the extended version of his essay, he even says, the reason we don't have enough IRS auditors is because slavery handicapped the formation of the IRS, which is completely ahistorical. First, the IRS didn't exist back then, but he also claims that its predecessor entities and agencies didn't have the bureaucratic apparatus because slavery somehow prevented it. He also claims the United States didn't impose an income tax until late in the game, 1913, because slavery somehow prevented it. Turns out I've gone back to the records of that. Do you know which states ratified the federal income tax first in 1913? The states of the old Confederacy. Why did they do it? Because they thought they could transfer the tax burden that was originally paid by tariffs onto those Yankees up in the Northeast who were high income earners of industry. So the income tax actually really comes from the old Confederacy. So complete inversion of what Desmond's story is. But even more fundamentally than that, at the intellectual level, he's saying free market capitalism and slavery are derivative, intertwined together. Well, let's go back to the father of the basic theory of free market capitalism, Adam Smith. What does he have to say about slavery? There you go. Turns out Adam Smith was an abolitionist. Wanted to get rid of the institution and said that this insidious institution tends to operate where the slave owners themselves work their way into the government and pass laws to prop up slavery. And he says this is the real difficulty of some of our political theory, is how to get rid of this institution. So you have the founding figure of capitalism is an abolitionist, and yet capitalism is somehow wedded to slavery, according to this thesis. Something's a little bit wrong here. There's another side of it. We'll introduce Thomas Carlisle. That's not Carlisle, that is Carlisle. Carlisle is an interesting character. You saw the famous painting by James McNeill Whistler of his mother in a museum or art gallery or something, and went to the painter and said, did the Titanic thing. He says, I'd like you to paint me like that girl in your painting. And next thing you know, he had a painting of himself. Brief foray into who Thomas Carlyle is. He was a very prominent public intellectual, Scottish historian, essayist, writer in the 19th century, also one of the champions of the pro-slavery side of the debate, even after Britain abolished slavery. He starts to blame the British Empire's economic decline on the fact that it no longer had a slave system. Why? Because he thought free market capitalism had displaced slavery, and he thought free market capitalism was worse at producing goods than the slave system. Why is Carlyle important? Because as an intellectual figure in the mid-19th century, he writes a pretty horrific essay in 1849 where he lays out what he saw as the alliance between the Adam Smith followers, the free market economists, and the abolitionists. He said this alliance has, through the sacred cause of supply and demand and the sacred cause of Black emancipation, wedded the two together under something he deemed the dismal science, economics. He said free market economics leads to the abolition of slavery. And in fact, his essay is picked up and carried across the Atlantic, where it falls into the hands of a pamphleteer by the name of George Fitzhugh. Fitzhugh was the leading pro-slavery pamphleteer on the eve of the American Civil War, the guy that would get into debates with abolitionists and represent the other side of the cause. Well, what does Fitzhugh do? Well, he seizes on Carlyle's theory and writes a book called The Sociology for the South, or The Failure of a Free Society, and what he meant was the failure of a free economy. He says political economy is the science of the free society. It reduces everything to laissez-faire, and laissez-faire is at war with all kinds of slavery, for it asserts that people prosper the most when they are governed least. Fitzhugh also declares himself a socialist. It's a really odd character. Why I lay this out? Well, the intellectual history of capitalism is completely at odds with the claims about capitalism in the 1619 Project, the Desmond essay. And it gets worse from there. It ventures into outright incompetence as historical analysis. I mentioned the school, The New History of Capitalism, Desmond relies on. It draws from a couple books. One of the foremost is this 2014 book by Edward E. Baptist called The Half Has Never Been Told. This is one of the most economically illiterate works I've ever read, even to the point that probably the most notorious part of Baptist is he purports to calculate the percentage of American GDP that derived from slavery. His figure he gives is 50%. And it turns out he reinvented the GDP formula to double, triple, and quadruple count all the different components of the American economy to raise them to a point to where half of the American economy was derived from slavery. Problem is, if you go actually recalculate it the right way, 5 to 6%, quite a bit difference. But Baptist also offers this theory. He says that slavery is necessarily capitalistic because cotton yields increased by 400% between 1800 and 1860. And they did so because plantations became more efficient at beating labor out of enslaved persons, torturing them. Torture absolutely existed on the plantations, but there was a problem with this claim. The economists he got that number from read his book and they started scratching their head and they kind of had a what the hell moment. You misused our statistics, because the same paper where they calculated the 400% growth in cotton output, they also found the reason for that growth. And it wasn't more efficient capitalistic ways of beating slaves, technology. They had cross-blended seeds of cotton to increase the yield. They had improved technology to weather through droughts, all sorts of things like that. So it's mostly seed yield was discovered, and they found this as the major output inducer. So the economists said to Baptist, you misused our stats. and you're misrepresenting everything that we have indicated in our scholarship. And he says, I don't care. Refuse to engage with them. It's a really bad form of history. I pointed this out again to the New York Times. You see up there, that's tweeted it at Nicole Hannah-Jones, the editor of the 1619 Project. I said, you know, you're relying on a discredited book for your economic thesis here. And she responds, economists dispute a few Baptist calculations, but not the book itself, nor its central thesis. I said, like, you want to bet? There's Alan Olmsted, the author of the study that calculated the seed production yield going up by 400%. He says, Edward Baptist's study of capitalism and slavery is flawed beyond repair. And you have other economists, and this could go on. I could do an entire, like 10 pages of critiques of this book. What it turned out is that the 1619 Project, when they organized this essay, they were completely unaware of the academic scholarly literature outside of this echo chamber of the new historians of capitalism. You have over and over again people that actually work and study on this saying, we've looked at the numbers of this book. It's junk. New History of Capitalism has pervasive problems. I won't get into too much. I mentioned, though, that the fact that the faulty statistics are used to prop up a narrative that is suspiciously similar to the King Cotton thesis on the eve of the Civil War. They've almost unintentionally rehabilitated King Cotton economic theory and asserted it to be true, even though they're arguing against it. They dislike capitalism, so they say King Cotton is true, that must discredit capitalism, whereas the Southerners were saying, we dislike capitalism too, but King Cotton is true, and that just vindicates slavery as an alternative to capitalism. That was the real argument that was there. And, you know, there's pervasive problems in this literature. Desmond actually responds to some of these criticisms, including some that I wrote to the New York Times, basically lied through his teeth. And the one response I got back from him, where he claimed that he never made a causal assertion based on Ed Baptist's book. You can pull it out and see it's right there in the text. He makes a causal assertion based on Ed Baptist's book. But he became even more ideological in the expanded book-length essay on the economics of slavery. And there's I won't read the full quote there, where he announces, though, that the real problem with slavery is it's economically disruptive to labor class consciousness. Not because it violates the rights of an individual human being, it disrupts and prevents labor class consciousness from emerging. Because it divides the labor force. That's basically his main objection. And he says, really, that you know, one of the legacies of slavery, he spells this out outright. He says, the legacy of slavery is that the laboring class did not emerge as a unified political system in the United States, and therefore they were unable to organize together and bring about the socialist revolution that we should have had. It's a pretty bold claim. It's actually kind of economic crankery, because it's not only a Marxian claim, it's a very narrow form of a Marxian claim. It comes from a branch of Marxism in Germany. Let's see if I got, there he is. This fellow by the name of Werner Sombart, who's real active around the turn of the 20th century. He writes a book called Moderner Capitalismus. And he lays out the exact same thesis as Matthew Desmond. He says that the problem with slavery is it divided up the laboring classes and prevented the socialist revolution from taking form. Sombart's a bit of a problem for historical reasons, because not only is this a bad thesis, it's just like Marxist ideology overlaid on top of history. Sombart gets involved in some pretty nasty political movements in his day, not only the socialist side, but by about 1930, he becomes a variant of the socialist side. He declares himself a national socialist. Writes a book basically arguing that Hitler is the fruition of socialist ideology. So not really someone that I would turn to build an interpretation on, and yet that's what Matthew Desmond did. So that's where I get through the critiques of the 1619 Project. I do want to say one area where it did get something right, and this even goes to Nicole Hannah-Jones's credit initially, but this is where I think something changes. And the title of the talk was 1619 Project means never having to say you're sorry. This is where that comes from. What did the 1619 Project get right? Well, it added nuance to the American anti-slavery movement by drawing attention to the fact that anti-slavery causes were not always aligned with racial egalitarianism. And one of the points of this was highlighting the often overlooked or little known story of the colonization movement. That was the effort to, after you free slaves, you relocate them back to Africa and what is now Liberia, or a little bit later on, they tried Central America. And this was a persistent political movement, basically from Thomas Jefferson's day all the way through the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Supported by Lincoln, absolutely supported by Lincoln. Even though he's an anti-slavery man, he supports colonization, and there's a debate over his reasons for doing so. The charitable one is that even though it's a deeply paternalistic approach, Lincoln did genuinely fear what, in some cases, came to fruition, that after the Civil War, after freedom is granted to the slaves, that they would be oppressed by some political entity, kind of like the Ku Klux Klan. And he said that one of the solutions to that is to remove the source of tension, remove people that are likely to be victims of that violence. So it's very paternalistic, but he's saying it's to the former slaves, it's in your interest to go away because your former masters are still going to oppress you. So it's humanistic, even though it's kind of paternalistic and top down, and it's not a liberal policy in the modern sense. It's kind of hard to grasp. But colonization is very prominent. Jefferson supported it. James Madison was president of the American Colonization Society after his presidency of the United States, and a whole slew of political figures all the way through Abraham Lincoln are members of this movement and organization. And the 1619 Project does point it out initially. And in fact, there it is in the text. She talks about a colonization speech and meeting that Abraham Lincoln held at the White House with a group of African-American abolitionists in 1862. In highlighting this, she actually got attacked by some of the same historians that I was aligned with on other early causes in critiquing her assessment of the American Revolution. She got attacked for pointing out these facts. They said, "Oh, you're being too mean to Lincoln, and the colonization movement has been exaggerated and overstated." And turns out that she was actually more on the right side of this issue in the way that she framed it. And in defense of her case, she did what she normally does. She took to Twitter. And she fires off a bunch of tweets by saying that new scholarship, recent scholarship shows that Lincoln, all the way to the end of the Lincoln presidency, they continued the colonization effort. Further, McPherson, she's attacking one of her critics, James McPherson, isn't even answering the question. I asked whether Lincoln believed that colonization, and this has nothing to do with the question I'm asking. Here's the new evidence, link to Amazon.com, link to a book. Let's open that link. There's the book. And I encourage you to pay attention to the author of that book. I apologize. That is myself. Yeah, I know it's a little bit dark there. That is a book that I wrote. So I was actually quite surprised when she did this. She said, "No, my source is this book." And then she later linked to some other things. So she tweeted out eventually another link to a piece in 2013 in the New York Times. And you can see the author of that a little bit more clearly. It was on the colonization movement. That was an article I wrote in the Disunion series. I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe she's not all bad. Maybe she actually does study the nuances of history, and she brings something to bear here. It's great. This is the fall of 2019 when she's doing that in defense. And then someone pointed out to her that I was the author of those books and columns, And she looked at that and realized I was also the author critiquing other parts of the 1619 project, and she did not like that. But her evidence was right, because we do know that colonization is there. It's part of the emancipation story. In fact, here's a document that I found. I apologize, it's blurry, but it is one of the orders to establish a colony in the Central American region in what's modern day Belize that Lincoln signed. Original document I discovered in the Belizean National Archives to establish the colony. In fact, the ruins of the colony are still there in the jungle in Belize. It's a real thing. Nicole Hannah-Jones was right on this one point, and she was right to cite me because the history is sound. But as soon as she found out I was the author, she changed her story and began tweeting some more, which I'll read a few of those. What are the credentials exactly of Phil Magness? Phil Magness dismisses the historians who wrote for the project and says they are not specialists in their period. Neither is he. And he talks about who we consulted when he has no idea. Anything else? And then at one point, I asked her directly. I said, what gives here? First, you're citing my work, and now you're attacking me. He says, well, you are not a specialist in that area either, and that didn't stop you from writing about it. And to show how this is going on, the attacks continue. Further, PM isn't an expert on 1619. He doesn't know anything about it. What's he critiquing this? The tweets continue and continue and continue. They were still going as of last week, and they're all about how I'm a horrible person because I critiqued the 1619 project, even though initially she was citing my work on behalf of the 1619 project. She did revise that section of her essay when they issued the new book form. The paragraph that I was the basis of, apparently, was removed and replaced by a paragraph arguing a different interpretation of the same events cited to Ibram X. Kendi. So I got displaced because I dared to critique other parts of the 1619 project through no merit-based assessment of my scholarship. Rather, what she did was excised me from the story and replaced it with Ibram X. Kendi. Unfortunately, this has been a recurring pattern for the 1619 project. This is where I think they've really lost the narrative, and I'll close on this point and be happy to take any questions that you have. So about 6 months after the project was published, it was under contention for a Pulitzer Prize, and it eventually won that. But on the eve of contention, it was in the thick of a heated controversy, mostly around that first essay and the claims about the American Revolution. But one of the more troublesome lines in that first essay came in its header. And this is an interpretive difference, not so much a factual one, but an interpretive one that comes with a very bold claim associated with it. That interpretive claim in the original said that the purpose of this project is to reframe the country's history, understanding that 1619 was our true founding, not 1776. And this matters metaphorically for understanding like what's the aim of the entire set of essays. And if you're going to make a claim like that, that's a pretty bold, aggressive, and potentially very controversial historical claim, saying 1776 is less important than 1619, the arrival of the first African slaves in Virginia, although it's a more complicated story we could get into. But nonetheless, that's why she picks that date. In fact, she tweeted this claim multiple times, spoke in public lectures about it, even had an image made up that had the year 1776 crossed out and replaced by 1619. It's a major theme and narrative of the 1619 project, but it was one that was also pilloried in the press because it's so brazenly controversial, and it has essentially a metaphorical repudiation of the Declaration of Independence that's implied by this. If you're going to say the Declaration of Independence needs to be displaced, that's a pretty controversial historical claim, especially for something you're trying to put in front of the classroom, trying to bring into institutions. So the New York Times is taking flack for this particular line, and they're up for Pulitzer contention. What did they do? someone quietly went on the website and deleted the line. They just made it disappear. No edit, no announcement, no correction. They just took it away. And this wasn't discovered for a couple months, until a couple months after the edit had been made. I ended up actually being the person that broke the story on this. So Nicole Hannah-Jones, if she hated me before that, she really hates me now because of this. So I broke the story because that controversial line was raised in a series of commentaries and interviews. And then I think eventually, as he was prone to do at the time, Donald Trump tweeted out something about the 1619 Project in the run-up to the 2020 election. And all hell broke loose again with people commenting on it. And then this line came up again. And I'm watching CNN one day, and Nicole Hannah-Jones is on there, and they asked her about this line. She says, I never said that. And I'm like, the hell you didn't? So I go look up the line. First, I find several tweets where she had in fact said it, found some speeches, and other journalists are working on the same thing, and we're all kind of scratching our heads saying, what went on here? Why is she lying on CNN? Is it to be anti-Trump or anything? I said, wait a minute. That line was in the original 1619 project. I'll just go back to the website and get a screenshot of it and say, what's in your own essay? So I go back to the website and it's no longer there. And I thought I was going crazy for a moment. And then I found I dug up an old archived copy, and sure enough, it had been deleted. And I wrote it up as a news story. It actually caused a minor civil war in the New York Times' newsroom because one of their own columnists, Bret Stephens, wrote his weekly column about this, the deletion of the line, including on how mystified he was that his own newspaper would basically commit an act of journalistic misconduct. Yeah. He needs to know his newspaper a little bit better, but he looks this up, and then he recounts his story. He says, I asked the other side of our editorial room, what did they do? And they didn't have any convincing answer of why they would make this edit, and they certainly didn't disclose it. And the very fact that Bret Stephens even wrote about that was blasphemous in the New York Times' newsroom. And of course, all these activist reporters blew up in anger and rage at him and called for him to be fired, tried to get him canceled, because how dare you critique one of your own? You broke the code of silence. It's kind of like a mafia thing or something that's going on there. Unfortunately, I think this is symptomatic of where the 1619 Project goes. And I can show you it's still ongoing, because this was in 2020 that I made this discovery and broke the story, and other journalists noticed it as well. Well, as of a year later, Nicole Hannah-Jones is still adamantly saying there were no self-corrections ever made. Like, no self-corrections. There's a self-correction, no self-correction. I mean, do you not believe the evidence in front of your eyes? That's the question of what's going on here. Why is this symptomatic of the 1619 Project's turn? Well, I think it exemplifies where the 1619 Project goes completely off the rails. And that is not the initial publication, which made some bold and controversial claims and made some erroneous claims. But erroneous claims can be a point of debate and contention. Erroneous claims can be corrected, addressed, expanded upon, and teased out through nuance, which is what they should have done when people began to scrutinize those problems that I highlighted. Instead, they doubled down and pretended there were no problems at all, and then turned their guns of attack on the people that pointed out the problems. And then they tried to cover up the problems, and that's essentially where we ended up today. So the real tragedy of the 1619 Project is not the errors that it started with, but the fact that it engaged in a cover-up of those errors. And it persists and continues to engage in that cover-up today, basically leaving us with a project that never does, in fact, say it's sorry, even when it's unambiguously in the wrong. And I'll end on that and be happy to take any questions.
Well, thanks a lot, Phil, and I'll go to anyone who has questions, but first I have a question from myself.
All right.
That's what I always do when I lead this. So you said one of the reasons that the purpose of the 1619 project was to serve as a resource for schools.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So as often happens, there was an overreaction. And I believe someone or a group came up with, it was probably called the 1776 project,
Yeah.
if I had to guess.
Yeah.
Because it's fairly obvious. So can you just kind of mention that?
Yeah. So this was when the Trump tweet started. He created a 1776 commission. It was supposed to be the counterweight to the 1619 project. So it was in the run-up to the election in 2020. And what did they do? Well, they thought, well, we're going to have a political battle. 1619 project has one political narrative. We're going to have another historical account that favors our side of the political spectrum. What goes on when that sort of thing happens is you see the type of politics that have plagued K through 12 education for time immemorial, and that is the textbook wars of current modern day political groups trying to get their messages into how we talk about the past. So in some sense, the 1619 project itself was a reaction to the other side historically doing this, but it was a reaction in all the wrong ways. They said, well, people in the past have politicized American history to gloss over slavery. We're going to politicize American history to tell the story of slavery. And then Trump comes in and says, no, we're going to politicize American history and gloss over slavery again. So it's like this contest that's played out between two sides of the political spectrum, and neither of them is actually getting to the meat of what true historical analysis and scholarship is. So this has been kind of a degrading characteristic of this type of a debate, and the approach both the Times took and some of its less careful critics took is rather than actually digging into the complexities of history, which I say is the answer to all of these problems, is go to the sources, go to teach the nuance and the conflicts as they actually played out. Don't try to fit them to your political narrative. Instead, you have competing political narratives that really move into the territory of kind of stupid things. This is where you get the bills that say, we're just going to ban the 1619 project, or Biden saying, we're just going to ban the 1776 project and rescind it. This is the kind of stuff that's just using government as a tool to control and dominate the narrative, when what we really should be doing is looking to the historical evidence.
Whoever's closest.
I have more of a comment than a
Yeah.
question, but I'd like to get your take. To me, it's to show just how far left the country has moved in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
In 2000, Gary Nash's National History Standards was put to a vote in the US Senate, and it was so far left that it was rejected by a vote of 99-1 in the US Senate. That was about 20 years ago. I'm guessing, and I'd like to get your take, if a vote were put in the US Senate today on something like that, like the 1619 project, it might well be 50-50.
Yeah. I suspect that is the case, and mainly because the political parties have rallied behind either being pro or anti-1619. I think the pro-1619 project does view it as a mechanism to insert politics into the classroom, into the past. And that's a lot of what we're seeing. There are several state and local governments, especially what we call the blue states or blue cities, that have mandated the teaching of the 1619 project as part of their curriculum. And there are others on the other side that say, well, we should ban it. I'm not an advocate of banning. I say, if you want to teach it in a way that does the controversy, shows both sides, show the critics as well. And students can actually, I think an intelligent student can read through the evidence and conclude where it goes astray. So that's the real answer.
Thank you. I have two quick questions regarding the role of capitalism in slavery. One is that, analyzing or looking at different economic systems throughout history, it would seem that American slavery was actually more akin to feudalism rather than capitalism.
Yes.
In the way it was structured, the governance, the economic flow, etc. That makes sense to you?
it absolutely does. And this was probably the dominant perspective of historians outside of the new history of capitalism school until very recently. But it's certainly true. If you look at the slave owners themselves, they view themselves as like feudal lords. Only instead of a castle at the top of the hill, they have a plantation. And they describe themselves as the caretakers of the tenants of their plantation who were forced to be there, but really kind of an insidious feudalistic approach to the economy. And they declared that that type of production was superior to the wage slavery of the North and the people working in the factories. And, they really denounced the conditions of the factories. So there is an explicitly anti-capitalistic message that comes out of the slaveholding ideological tracks.
And the second one is just regarding this newer school of thought you mentioned about where this thought of capitalism being dependent on slavery for its origins and its support. Do they have any empirical or economic data supporting at all any actual facts, any economist or economic analysis supporting this view?
They make it up as the answer on the data. When economists have tried to correct them, the standard line has been, shut up, you're racist. And where they do have economists that they've tried to bring into their corners, it's always these weird, like heterodox Marxian economists that use very unusual styles of math and calculation to come up with the claim that that slavery is indeed the centerpiece of the economy. So I'd say the short answer is it's not academically robust.
So I saw that answer coming when you were laughing at when the question was being asked. Yes.
I think intuitively, it would make sense that free labor is good for an economy. It intuitively would make sense. But some of the evidence suggests that slavery was actually harmful to the economy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak more about that.
Yeah. So this is a great empirical question in the historical literature. We do know that slavery was profitable, including on the eve of the Civil War. This was established very early on in some empirical economic studies, and it's been bolstered ever since then. But profitable doesn't mean necessarily good. It's profitable in the sense it made a lot of money for a very few people, for a small group of elite slave owners. The question is that profitability a natural economic condition, or is it a result of other factors around it? And I'm in the camp that argues that there are other factors around it that make slavery profitable. First and foremost among those is what Adam Smith pointed out. The slave owners vote themselves resources from the government, from the taxpayers, to prop up their institution. They vote themselves public money to run a fugitive slave patrol. They vote themselves money to have arsenals and armaments and forts to put down slave revolts. They hand over basically the policing power of slavery off of the plantations budget books. They no longer have to privately police their grounds, and they put it onto the public. So my question that I'd approach that with is asking, even though slavery is profitable, is that profitability contingent on the fact that they have massive public subsidy? And I think the evidence is pretty strong that it is. The other component of that is if you start doing the economic calculations, you figure out that even though there's a very visible, small, elite group of wealthy slave owners, there's also abject poverty around them. Not only in the white small farmers of the South, you also include the poverty of the enslaved people themselves. That's part of the calculation. And, you do the balance sheet on that. There's a lot more downside than there is upside when you put the two side by side. So I think Smith's arguments about the inefficiency of slavery win out even when we have evidence of its profitability. All right, we may have some online questions, I think.
Online question. Okay, I screened the questions first. 'Cause
All right.
sometimes you get some rude ones. This one's fine.
Okay.
You've seen rude questions.
Oh, yeah.
before. I've
Oh,
seen you
yeah.
on
I mean,
Twitter.
I'll take a rude question if it's a,
Okay, okay, so the question is, has Phil published an article that summarizes the presentation he has given tonight? It'd be nice to have one succinct text
yeah.
containing the points. Well, I would, say is your book.
The book, yeah, that's the right answer. So it's a bit more than an article. It's about 100 pages instead of something you can read in an afternoon. But it does cover all of the major points that I make.
So what's the title?
It's called the 1619 Project, a Critique,
So is it on Amazon?
and is on Amazon.
So
costs-
Magness 1619 project will
Yep,
get you this book.
that'll get it.
Well, then there's a statement, it's hard to get our undergrads to read an entire book, but this is a slim volume, I think is the expression, if that's right. Is it a slim volume?
It is, it is. It's very readable, written in such a way to be accessible. If you want the really short version of it, there's an article I wrote in the National Review Reflection on the 1619 project about its economics. That's like the 1,200 word version.
How about 12? Yeah, how about 12? I'm talking to my screen. So 1,200 words. Okay, any other questions?
Okay, thank you. What grade level are they teaching this?
It
And are they
is,
te-
ooh. So this is the real, it's really kind of an insidious aspect of the way that New York Times has behaved. They rolled this thing out in August 2019 with a prepackaged K through 12 curriculum that covers everything from kindergarten through 12th grade. And it lays out lesson plans that are built around some really shoddy and suspect history. The way they did it is they had this prepackaged and ready to go as soon as the volume came into print and before any actual real scrutiny had been given to the volume. So that K through 12 curriculum reflects like an uncorrected version of the 1619 project. And then beyond that, there have been attempts to move it into the college classrooms. Those are much more so with the, so go back to the book version that they released, which is right there. That came out earlier this year, and it's a much thicker volume, but it's basically the same essays with some expansion on it.
So that's being taught as the truth, and it's not like
Basically.
a theory.
Yes.
And
Yeah, every bit of evidence I've seen, that they certainly don't teach the controversy around the 1619 project. They don't do, well, here, read the 1619 project, and here's a collection of essays by its critics. That seems to be much more rare. It's all, let's adopt this curriculum. And the New York Times does kind of this sleight of hand type of a thing where they say, well, public schools, you shouldn't ban this. And I agree with them, don't ban it, because that's a way to backfire on you. But also, by the way, you should adopt it. So there's the flip side of the coin. And I'm saying neither ban it nor adopt it. Teach it if you want to teach the controversy, but give a fair shake of the full spectrum of the criticisms. And I think most students are generally intelligent human beings. And if they work through it, they will find where the flaws are, where some of the redeeming qualities are, where the errors are, and where the 1619 project goes astray, and come to a pretty reasonable conclusion.
Isn't this the same sort of thing that's happening in all of our schools with, instead of teaching math and science and geometry and so on and so forth, history, as it's actually
politics.
played, our kids are being taught things that are not useful to them. And employers don't like it.
Yep.
But what do we do about it?
Yeah, I wish I had an easy solution to that. I do think school choice and freeing up, allowing parents to move their students around, vote with their feet, are ways that we can put some competitive pressure on this type of a thing. But what we're up against, and maybe that's a better way to tackle it. What can we do about it? We need to understand what we're up against. Well, it turns out teaching really suspect stuff and a lot of what I'd call fluff and nonsense, and the worst end of it is just pure political activism masquerading as classroom instruction. That's a good money maker for the education industry, because they get to employ people, pay people to teach this stuff, pay people to be professional activists, and they have a captive audience of students that are forced to attend those classes. So that's really the crux of the problem, is the captive audience. And captive audience means that there's no customer relationship, there's no consumer relationship between the parent and the provider of the education, because you just have to go there, and that's that. So I think really the answer is we actually need to free up the education system, and several states are moving in that direction. So I take that as an encouraging sign.
Well, so our time is up.
All right.
And people here at least will have time to continue the discussion. And remember that we have so you don't even have to raise your hand. You can go right up to Phil and yell at him right in front of him. He's used to it.
Outstanding.
So everyone who's joined us virtually, thank you for joining us. And I should have mentioned that we have a co-host for this event, which is Northwood University. So thank you, anyone from Northwood who joined us. So on that, remind you to check out our website at hammondinstitute.org and to check out our upcoming events, including the Mark Shug event in February. So thank you.